This is the premiere episode of the Bangers and Mash Show. I'm Mr. Bangers, otherwise known as Zach.
I'm Mash, and that's all you're getting.
It's JD. This is the Bangers and Mash Show, and basically what this vidcast slash podcast is we're two nerds, and we're going to talk about the kind of stuff we were going to talk about anyway, which is horror movies and comic books and just stuff, but usually horror movies. That's the main focus of the podcast here.
Well, let's get started.
Basically, for me, horror fandom begins with the Universal monster movies. I'm assuming anybody listening to the show probably knows what those are, but just a brief educational stop in. Basically, the Universal horror series begins in 1931 with the original Dracula. And, in my opinion, the classic series continues until about 1959 with The Leech Woman, I feel is the last of the Universal monster movies. But we're not going to be talking about all of that today. We're going to focus on what, in my opinion, are the four main series, which is the Dracula films, the Frankenstein films, the werewolf movies, and my personal favorite, Creature from the Black Lagoon. And we're also going to talk about the Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, because I feel those are important as well. I can really remember where my horror fandom begins, and it begins probably around 1995 with a little cable network that used to be really good and now blows ass called AMC. And every Friday night they had a program called SFX, which was hosted by the late, great Stan Winston. Every Friday night they would show a genre film, usually horror. And at the time, I guess in 1995 it was about, 10? 9, 8, 7, one of those.
It was probably around 10.
Yeah, and I was really into Godzilla. And I saw a Godzilla movie on FEX one night and decided, well, I want to keep watching this because I want to see all the Godzilla movies I haven't seen. And then they started showing, I think it was Frankenstein was the first one I saw. And I was pretty much hooked from there on in. From the time period of about 10 to 13, I was obsessed with Universal monsters. And to a degree, still am. And really just sort of made it a quest to see all of the Universal monster movies. That was really kind of the beginning of my horror fandom. The older I get, the more I appreciate the classic films. I don't want this to be a podcast where we just bitch about how much horror sucks nowadays. But it seems to me there aren't really a lot of really good horror movies made anymore. Seems like there are more made that aren't good. But just for me, the Universal classics, those films are so singular and so iconic. JD's going to make fun of me, but I use this word a lot. And the atmosphere of those films, the black and white, foggy atmosphere, it's so strong. If I was going to live in a movie, it would be in those films. I just adore these movies and everything about them.
Not everybody has a sick fantasy to get, killed by Frankenstein's monsters.
I don't want to be killed by Frankenstein's monster. I'd like to be Frankenstein's monster.
So you'd be chained up and torched?
Yeah, I mean, he was friends with Igor. It was Fritz that tortured him. We're going to talk about that. Sort of give you an idea. I'm the hardcore, aspy. JD's the more casual one of the two of us. Where was your first exposure to these films?
It would be on the Monster Fest. Well, it used to be Monster Fest, but now it's Fear Fest or whatever.
Fest, yeah, and they just show
back in the day when it was on Monster Fest. That would probably be the first time that I had seen the classic Dracula. And ever since then, I've just been, and Zach can tell you, a Dracula nut. I love anything good, gory, vampire-related stuff.
And there's not a lot of good vampire movies made anymore.
No, because of fucking Twilight and his twatties.
Ugh. We hate them, but
yeah, they're just awful.
But Monster Fest on AMC, a whole month of classic horror. Oh, and that was AMC. Nowadays, it's full of commercials and everything's cut and it's all shitty and awful. But back in the mid '90s, we didn't get TCM here on our basic cable package, so I didn't get exposed to Turner Classic Movies until I was a little bit older. AMC was really kind of the basic cable version of Turner Classic Movies in a lot of ways. And it was an incredible lineup of the classics and some other B-movie stuff. I remember seeing Burt I. Gordon's The Beginning of the End, the giant killer grasshopper movie, on AMC Monster Fest back in the day. I miss that so much. I wish it was still around and it was still good. TCM usually has a pretty good lineup of classic horror during October, but it's not a whole 3 weeks of nothing but classic horror. It's not quite that insulated.
Well, they should do something about that.
They should, I agree. But let's start at the beginning. The first movie in the cycle, and really kind of the first monster movie, period. Phantom of the Opera, Nosferatu, all came before, but really the horror genre as we know it didn't really start until 1931 with the original Dracula.
Which is such a great movie, even in the opening credits when they have the Transylvanian armadillos.
Oh, I love the armadillos. The thing about this one was directed by Todd Browning, who was a silent film director. He had done The Unknown with Lon Chaney and a lot of other good films. Freaks is the movie that came next and pretty much destroyed his career. We'll talk about Freaks some other day. That's a good film as well. The original Dracula, when I first saw it, which was probably around the same time when I saw Frankenstein, it really didn't impress me. And for a long time, I didn't like this movie because it's extremely stagey. It was actually based off a stage play. The movie was originally conceived as a big budget, extravaganza sort of film, big sets, big costumes. It was going to be a big movie, and then a couple things happened. First off, Lon Chaney, who was Todd Browning's original pick for the role of Dracula, died. And then the Wall Street collapse happened, and the country was plunged into the Great Depression, and suddenly nobody had any money. So they decided to scale Dracula way, way, way back, and it was based off, there was a version of Dracula playing that was very successful and very popular. And the film became a straight adaptation of that. And that staginess is very evident in many scenes. I think the scene where Dr. Stewart and Van Helsing are in the building and they point off screen and say, "Look,
a wolf.
A wolf is crossing the yard, a great dog." And, there are no... Dracula doesn't turn into a bat in this one. This really isn't what you would call an effects movie by any modern standards. But it is a wonderful film, and I really think one of the main reasons for that is, Bela Lugosi.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can't top his Dracula.
He's the iconic Dracula in many ways. To this day, when people talk like this, and with the heavy accent, I never drink wine. People who have never seen the original Dracula know what that is. It's really completely insulated and slipped into the popular subconscious.
And, even nowadays, when they do, cartoon vampires and things like that, they're heavily modeled after Bela Lugosi's Dracula.
The legacy of Bela Lugosi lives on in Sesame Street and Count Chocula, The more I see this movie, I try and watch the Universal monster movies every Halloween. It's really the tradition with me. It strikes me, again, here's that word, atmosphere. It's incredible. First off, that opening sequence JD was talking about, when we first see Dracula's castle. These early films from the early 30s, sound was still a new thing, and musical scores were not prevalent. There weren't really any films this early on that had scores. And it was just a few years later that scores became commonplace, but in 1931, musical scoring was not common. So basically, it's a series of shots through the castle with the bats and the armadillos and the little bug coffin. Mm-hmm. I always loved that. I always wondered, what the hell? Why does the beetle have a coffin? And then it's just that scene, you see Dracula's brides walking through the fog, and there's so much fog in this movie, it's wonderful. And then that slow pan in on Dracula's face, and the lights are right on his eyes.
Well, every time I watch that movie, to this day, when I see that scene, I get cold chills because
it's incredible.
It pulls you on the edge of your seat and tells you, this guy is going to be up to no good in this movie.
Really kind of establishes, just through visual, that Dracula is a sinister figure. And there's another scene where he first gets to England, and he's walking through the streets of London in his top hat and evening wear. And again, there's just so much fog, but it's like the fog is parting around him, as if Dracula has control over the very weather. And then he finds...
he does.
Well, he does. And then he finds the flower girl and attacks her, and it's just... I just love that scene. And one other thing, aside from Bela Lugosi, who's obviously the iconic figure in this movie, but a lot of the other acting in this film is wonderful.
The guy, I don't know his name.
Dwight Fry is Renfield.
Well, him too, but Van Helsing.
Yeah, Eric von Sloan, I believe, is the name of that actor. And he... Really, a lot of these Universal movies had sort of a stable of actors, and as we talk about them, you'll see that. But yeah, Edward von Sloan is great as Van Helsing. Really the iconic Van Helsing, at least until Peter Cushing came along. But my favorite is Dwight Fry as Renfield, who...
Oh, definitely.
Just so... Another, you want to talk about shots.
He did crazy really well.
Oh, incredible. You completely believe him.
He probably was crazy.
But that scene where they find the boat, the Demeter, I believe the boat in Dracula is called.
What was it?
The boat where Dracula's, travels the ocean on the boat, and they find all the crew dead. And the captain tied to the wheel, which is a great shot.
Yeah, but what did you say?
The Demeter, I believe.
That sounds right.
Yes. Yeah. They open up the door to the lower dock, and there's Renfield standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up, and he's just gleaming like a madman. And, Todd Browning was, like I said, a silent film director, and you can just really see in this movie, the images are so strong. Like I said, there is that staginess there, and one of the things that is unsatisfying about the movie is the fact that Dracula dies off screen.
I personally think that adds something to it.
It always disappointed me where... And that's the problem with some of these Universal movies, is a lot of them don't really have very good endings. In Dracula, he's kidnapped Mina, he's taken her to Carfax Abbey, there's that wonderful scene where he kills Renfield by throwing him down the stairs. Van Helsing finds him. They go off screen. I don't even think you see them pull the coffin open and him sleeping in the coffin. I think you do see that one shot.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you do.
And then you hear a hammering of a stake, a thump, and then and you don't, in some cuts you don't even hear this, but you hear Dracula go, ugh, and that's the end of the movie. You know, it's a little anticlimactic, but really I don't think we're going to besmirch this film in any way. It's a classic. Next movie, really in the chronology, you know, during the early days of sound, before dubbing and subtitles became a common practice, they would frequently shoot movies in both an English version and a Spanish version. They would shoot the English version on the same sets during the day, and then at night they would shoot the Spanish version. So, simultaneously shot as the Bela Lugosi Todd Browning Dracula was the Spanish version of Dracula. Some people think this is a superior film. What do you say about that, JD?
Personally, I don't like it as well. It lacks the finesse of Bela Lugosi.
The lack of Bela Lugosi is a serious problem with this film. Let me look up the actor who played Dracula. I mean, I think the movie has a stronger... I think the actress playing Mina is a stronger actress. I feel like the movie, you know, the shooting is not as static. I always remember the scene where when Dracula first steps out onto the stairs and welcomes Renfield to his castle. In the Spanish version, there's actually a dolly shot up the stairs towards Dracula's face, which is pretty cool.
Wasn't there also, I might be wrong, but wasn't it like less stagey?
I mean, parts of it are, yeah. It really is. I think, and this is a true story, that the people making this film were looking at the dailies of what Todd Browning shot. George Melford is the director. They were looking at the way he shot it and said, oh, well, we can do better than that, and actively attempted to top the movie. Carlos Villarias, pronunciation is incorrect, feel free to correct me, any listeners, was the guy who played Dracula. And Lupita Tovar is, it's Eva instead of Nina in this version, but that actress, I prefer her over the English language actress. And something else with this movie is all the actresses have lower cut nightgowns in this version. In the Spanish version is a little sexier than the English one. And I also like Pablo Rubio as Renfield. He's good too. The big difference between his death scene and Dwight Fry's death scene in the English version is that Dwight Fry is silent as he rolls down the stairs, but this guy screams the whole way down, which is kind of cool.
The copy of Dracula that I have, what Renfield screams when in the English version.
No, I'll have to double check this. I'll have to rewatch.
I mean, he doesn't scream all the way down, I don't think, but when Dracula first strikes him...
Yeah, grabs him. Yeah, he screams, but he doesn't scream down the stairs. And then in the Spanish version, the guy bellows the whole way down, which is kind of cool.
Well, yeah, but that just means that the Spanish Dracula was a pussy, couldn't kill him in one strike.
The same thing, it is essentially the same movie as the English version, you know. So it really isn't, I don't feel like it's superior. I prefer the English version, but it's good. It's worth checking out if you like Dracula. And now, the next movie, shot the same year as Dracula and released the same year, is, of course, I think, really, there are two pillars in the Universal Monsters universe, and that's Dracula, and the second one is Frankenstein. And JD's a Dracula fan, I'm a Frankenstein fan. This is my monster.
Well, I mean, I have an appreciation for Frankenstein. I mean...
Of course, yeah.
But he was made... Dracula just came into being that way.
And Dracula's a little cooler, because Dracula's evil. He's a stone cold motherfucker, and Frankenstein is really kind of a victim.
He's a retard with super strength, is what Frankenstein is.
That's putting it a little bluntly. Of course, this film was directed by James Wales. Very famous these days for being out and proud during the 1930s. Of course, Bela Lugosi was originally supposed to play Frankenstein. It varies. I've heard versions that he didn't want to sit for the makeup process. And I've also heard that he didn't want a role where he had no speaking lines. That's the more common version of the story. I've heard both. And supposedly, there was a makeup test with Bela Lugosi in a copy of the Frankenstein makeup. And it was completely different. It was based off of the German silent film The Golem, or Das Golem. And that film, the Golem has kind of a weird dome wig. And apparently Lugosi had a similar... I think that footage is lost these days. But somebody has seen it. I think David Skoll talks about it in one of his books. For whatever reason, Bela Lugosi passed on the part. And it ended up going to William Henry Pratt, otherwise known as Boris Karloff. And of course, this film made him a phenomenon. You know, as big as Lon Chaney Sr. was in the 20s, Karloff was that big in the 30s. Frankenstein's a wonderful film.
Yeah, I mean, it is. The atmosphere, as you put it, is great in that movie. It's just the scenery.
That opening scene where the Frankenstein and Fritz dig up the body in the graveyard.
Yeah.
Oh, man. If Dracula's all about fog, then Frankenstein is all about shadows and light. This is such visually a dark film.
And a great example of the shadow and light concept would be when he's in the dungeon and the light comes through and he reaches up for the light.
Oh, I love when the scene when the monster first comes out. And it's fascinating. When the monster first steps out, there's a cold cut close up to his face. And then he steps up and he sees the sun and he reaches up towards it. That is just a wonderful sequence. And the shot of him
almost makes you want to cry.
Oh, really? There's something about the way Karloff portrays the monster, especially in this first movie. I mean, he really is innocent in a way, and yet the film doesn't really shy away from the fact that the character is a murderous monster. The big difference between Dracula and Frankenstein is Dracula was born a monster, Frankenstein becomes a monster, and that's a theme straight from Mary Shelley's original book, which this film otherwise doesn't have a lot in common with.
Well, me, honestly, I don't really view Frankenstein as a quote-unquote horror movie. I view it more along the lines of dark drama.
It's a tragedy, really, is what it is in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he does kill a couple people throughout the story, but I mean, for the most part, it focuses on his trials and tribulations and basically what his experiences are.
Yeah.
They really take it from the point of view of the monster more so than...
In a lot of ways, I mean... Shit, what's the actor's name? Colin Clive as the Doctor. He's kind of unsympathetic in this movie. He's he's not abusive towards his fiancée, but he's negligent. I feel like you can probably read some of that. James, there's been a lot of term papers written about the homosexual subtext in these James Whale's Frankenstein movies. Frankenstein's not spending time with his girlfriend. He's up in the tower, with this little hairy guy, creating another man. I mean, when Rocky Horror Picture Show came out 3 decades later and made it into a story of a scientist creating the perfect man, all of that subtext really is kind of there in the original. It's very subtle, but it's there. More subtle than it is in Bride of Frankenstein, which we'll get to shortly. And of course, the flower girl scene is just a wonderful sequence. I love that when...
Now you're talking about with the little girl, right?
Oh, yeah. And I just love when the monster picks up the little girl and throws her in the water and she drowns. And his first response is one of abject horror. It's the expression on Karloff's face. He's searching around, his eyes are wide, his mouth is open. He doesn't know what's happening. It's such a fantastic performance from Karloff. And then later, when the father brings the dead child, first off, this is a dark movie. You've got kids dying, and the film was extremely controversial in the day it was made. There was a lot of edits. I know Colin Clive saying, "Now I know how it feels like to be God," was cut out. I know when they sedate the monster by stabbing him with a syringe, that was cut. And then, the entire Flower Girl sequence was cut. James Whale's was about pushing buttons. People say that horror in the 30s was tame, but it really, for its time, it was not tame at all. This was shocking stuff. People were fainting and yelling in the audience. Something interesting to talk about in the movie is the fact that Frankenstein was originally the doctor was supposed to die at the end. And that is really obvious when the monster picks up the doctor and throws him off the windmill, and you see this dummy, which is pretty blatant, hitting the blades as it goes down. Even when I first saw this movie as a young person, I always thought that epilogue scene where Elizabeth and Henry are happily reunited always felt kind of tacked on, which it was. So there's a reason for that. I could talk about Frankenstein for a while. I adore everything about this movie. But let's move on.
It is a great movie.
Classic.
I like Dracula more.
All of these are great movies. And the next movie we're going to talk about, I don't think you've seen this one, JD, have you?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay, well, from 1932 came Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's often been discussed the obvious influence that the German expressionistic horror movies of the 20s, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, Das Golem, etc., had on these early films. In fact, they had a lot of the same talent. Conrad Veidt from Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was the original choice for Dracula. And this movie, Murders in the Rue Morgue, is very heavily influenced by expressionistic cinema. There are so many shadows and darkness, and this is another this movie's kind of twisted. There are subtle themes of bestiality throughout this movie. The film is very, very loosely based off the Edgar Allan Poe short story. Bela Lugosi plays a mad scientist who's he's injecting ape blood into women he's abducted, who are heavily implied to be prostitutes. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but he seems to be wanting to breed humans and apes to create a race of super apes or something like that. I don't know how much of that is actual text and how much is subtext in that movie. It really is I need to rewatch it, but I remember it being a very strong film. The atmosphere is, again, there's that word atmosphere, but it's extremely heavy in this movie. It's a very dark, shadowy film. It's pretty spooky, really. It holds up. And the final chase over the rooftops of London between Dupin, the detective character, and the ape is pretty intense. There's some good stuff in this movie. If you haven't seen Murders in the Rue Morgues, I highly recommend it. The next movie we're going to talk about, which is JD has also not seen, is...
I've seen bits and pieces, but I haven't seen the whole thing.
Okay, it's the next Edgar Allan Poe adaptation in quotes there, The Black Cat. Now, this is a movie I did not like when I first saw it. Again, really, it's not even has nothing to do with the Edgar Allan Poe short story. In that, the similarities are that there's a black cat in the movie. That's pretty much the end. This film pits Lugosi and Karloff against each other. And what's surprising is Karloff plays the bad guy and Lugosi plays the hero. And this is a movie, the shadow of World War I really hangs over a lot of these early films. In Frankenstein, when he's wandering through the graveyards and the fields, and it just seems extremely desolate. It seems almost post-apocalyptic how stark it is. And really, The Black Cat deals with World War I. The premise is that, I believe it's Polzeg Hajammer is Karloff's character. He's based off of Aleister Crowley. And basically, he imprisoned Lugosi in the war, stole his wife, killed his wife, and then stole his daughter, and is now having an affair with his daughter. And this is a pretty sick and twisted movie for the 30s, and really even today. There are themes of Satanism in the movie. Karloff's character is pretty much directly stated to be a Satanist, or at least an occultist of some sort. There are themes of necrophilia, because he keeps Lugosi's wife, her dead body, in a glass chamber. And I believe he even sleeps in a bed with it in one scene. And
I seem to remember that myself.
Yeah.
So.
And there are themes of almost incest with the way he goes from the wife to the daughter. And then, of course, the finale of the movie, where, spoiler alerts for anybody who hasn't seen a 70-year-old film, where the scene where he lashes Karloff to the torture stand and then skins him. Of course, it's in shadow, but even today, that's pretty sick stuff. And it's just, when I first saw the film, I didn't like it, because I couldn't buy Lugosi as a hero. But rewatching it again a couple years ago, I really, really did like it a lot, because it's really kind of the fact that they're casted against type is kind of brilliant. And in the original cut of the original screenplay, Lugosi's character was much darker. He really was kind of without pity and remorse, and then they remade it to make it so that at least he's taking revenge on Karloff, so that his violence is justified somehow. And you want to talk about there are heavy expressionistic sets in this movie. The castle where Karloff's characters live is very strangely designed. There's a lot of weird angles, lots of influence from Cabinet of Dr. Caligari there. Black Cat is great. I know we're going to be saying that over and over again. This movie's great, that movie's great, but it's great. See it if you haven't seen it. So next year, 1935, of course, Frankenstein and Dracula are both huge financial successes. Big hits at the box office for Universal. And I think the idea of doing a sequel to both movies was considered pretty much immediately. Today, Hollywood is crazy about sequels, and they weren't quite that crazy about it in the 30s, but still, when you had a cash cow, you don't kill the cash cow, you keep it going. So I think an idea Frankenstein sequel was conceived pretty much immediate. It went through a long production process. Frankenstein was 31, Bride of Frankenstein was 35. That's a split of 4 years. And back in these days when you could crank out a movie in 6 months, that was a pretty big break. And you can really see how much cinema has evolved just in those first 5 years. First off, there's music and Bride of Frankenstein, a wonderful Franz Waxman score. The great thing about Bride of Frankenstein is that it's the first movie, there are very heavy themes in it, but the sequel ramps it up in so many ways. This is a movie where there's so much going on inside of it and underneath of it. Well, I frankly, I love it. A lot of people say it's better than the first one. I think they're both fantastic, and they run neck and neck for me. I think I like the first one just a little bit better because it's a little scarier.
I have to agree there. The first one's probably a little bit scarier. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, I would say that there's probably more recognizable one-liners, so to speak, in that movie. Yeah.
It's a very funny movie, first off. I mean, that's the reason why the first one's scarier, because the second, Bride of Frankenstein has a lot of humor.
It's camp.
Yeah, it really is camp, and that's the direct definition. This movie almost invented camp. As I said, James Wales was an open homosexual. I cannot remember the name of the actor who played Dr. Pretorius, but he instructed him to play the character as a bitchy old queen. So, and that, I mean, you were talking about gay subtext in this movie. Henry is with his wife, and then there's a knock at the door, and in comes Dr. Pretorius, who lures him away from his wedding bed into creating life without the role of a woman. So it's pretty blatant what's going on in this movie. How much of the creation process do you think is science, and how much do you think is magic? Because in the first movie, pretty much just lightning and technology brings the monster to life. But in this movie, Dr. Pretorius has the little people in the jars. And those, I mean, I think Henry even says something about how this isn't science, this is black magic. So how much of the process of creating the monsters do you think is science, and how much do you think is magic?
I would say it's probably a 90-10 split.
In what direction?
Towards science.
Okay.
There probably, maybe in the second film, is a little more magic involved, but
Pretorius is a little devil and the mermaid,
In the first movie, it is pretty much strictly science.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you want to count the lightning as a magical source.
Lightning can do anything in these movies. And, and in the original...
But the lightning thing does make sense, because, we do have the defibrillators now, and that's basically, essentially what we're...
And really, this movie was kind of commenting on the technology of the time. Electricity in homes was still sort of a new thing in 1931. So, and I think a lot of people have said that horror movies are always about responding to technology. And 10 years ago, you had things like The Ring and The Grudge, the monster coming through your cell phones and your videotapes. Actually, here on the internet you have, urban legends, and they call them creepypastas. This is sort of the evolution of every decade of horror comments on what's going on in that decade, and you can see that in these movies too. I read a great essay once about the Black Cat that said it was actually all about the rise of fascism in Europe before World War II. I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but it was a pretty interesting article. But Bride of Frankenstein, there's a lot to talk about in this movie.
Yeah.
First off, the monster is really more blatantly horrific in this film. The original cut of the movie put his body count at like 26.
Yeah, he
kills a lot of people in this movie.
Yeah, he's definitely gone past I'm a sad retard with super strength to I'm an angry retard with super strength and I'm going to flat out kill you.
I'm going to kill some people. And I'm really at the beginning of the movie. Well, first off, the very beginning of the movie, the flashback to Mary Shelley and Lord Byron. That's an interesting device. Mm-hmm. I almost feel like they put it in there to reflect upon the fact that the first movie had so little to do with Mary Shelley's novel. And really, of course, the concept of the Bride of Frankenstein comes from the original novel, though it doesn't get revived in the novel, but it's in there. And one thing that's always interesting about that is that Elsa Lanchester plays both Mary Shelley in the opening and the bride at the end, or the monster's maid, as she's called in the credits. And that's interesting, because they've never really come up with a satisfying explanation for why they did that. I cannot but wonder if it was just kind of a little in-joke, but it's cool nevertheless. I don't really know what it means, but I like it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't really know what it means, but I do like the fact that they added it in there. It kind of adds something to the movie.
Elsa Lanchester was really a beautiful woman. Is it weird that I find the Bride of Frankenstein so hot? Is that weird? Weird? A little weird, okay.
Because, she's technically dead.
Yeah, she's technically, and you can even see, the sutures where they kind of put her face on. I think she was intended to be beautiful. She's certainly not as grotesque as Karloff's monster.
Well, yeah, that's true.
And underneath that white gown, she has just, bandages on, She's, naked underneath there. Anyway.
You and naked women.
My desire to bang monsters is going to come up over and over again in this podcast. Anyway.
Over and over and over.
And something that's interesting in this movie is the bride is an iconic figure in and of herself. You see that wig so much, but she's only in the last 5 minutes of the movie. She's barely in it. It's not really about her at all.
Yeah, but she stands out. Even if you look at her makeup and her costume design, even though she's only in the last 5 minutes of the movie, they still really make up for it in her makeup design and she looks like her makeup and her costume just looks like it was designed to be for the full hour and a half long movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Something we haven't talked about is the makeup in these movies. Jack Pierce is the makeup man, pretty much responsible for the look of all the Universal monsters. And what's fantastic is this was the day before molds, appliances, and really he pretty much created the makeup out of a little kit. Rick Baker, the great modern effects artist, has talked about this many times. Jack Pierce would create the makeup from scratch out of this little kit. It was spirit gum and hair and glue. He'd just make it every day. And it was so... I wonder if somebody really wanted to take each movie apart piece by piece, frame by frame. You could see the differences in the makeup from scene to scene. I wonder how consistent it is. Obviously, it's consistent enough that you don't notice watching it. Yeah. But I'm sure there are some hardcore nerds out there who have done that. And the makeup design for the monster in Bride of Frankenstein is different. He has less hair, his hair has been burnt off, and what's really cool is in the first movie, the monster's cheek is hollow because Karloff, who was a World War I veteran, had a bridge in the back of his mouth. And for this movie, he would take the bridge out and suck his cheek in to give this kind of hollow, concave, corpse-like appearance. And in the second movie, the monster had to talk. So they couldn't do that. So that's another... The makeup it's slightly different, a little different. And that's something to talk about. Do you think the monster talking was a good thing?
Well, it gave us that great one-liner.
I knew that was coming.
We belong dead. I mean,
we belong dead.
And she hate me. I mean, those lines really do add something to the movie.
Oh, I mean,
but
the monster,
on the other hand,
as murderous as the monster is in this movie, he's still a tragic figure. And the scene with the blind man is so famous. And it's a lovely scene, I mean, it's been parodied a lot, and especially Brilliant and Young Frankenstein. It's a wonderful scene that really the creature is just looking for acceptance, even if he is kind of a cold-hearted, murdering bastard in this movie. And that end when he's rejected by the bride. And first the shrieking, Elsa Lanchester based that off of a swan. If you didn't know that, sort of interesting.
I didn't know that.
But in his rejection, I mean, I know we make fun of the line, she hates me, but it really gets to, and I just love, I don't know how true this is, but I believe in the original cut of the movie, Henry and Elizabeth didn't make it out of the castle before it blew up at the end. And first off, that's really convenient. They have a doomsday switch there in plain sight. Hey, imagine somebody walking in with the pizza and just like, hey, is this turn on the lights? Bam, poof, boom, everybody dead. Seems a little contrived, but whatever.
Well, I really like that they kind of, not to go completely off topic, but if you look at some of your cartoons nowadays, like Phineas and Ferb, for instance, Dr. Doofenshmirtz, or whatever his name is, he always has a self-destruct button on...
I wonder, was this the beginning of the obvious self-destruct button in pop culture?
Well, it would have to be. I mean... They clearly do that in Mystery Men. I mean, they clearly do an ode to that
Mystery Men, a movie we are going to talk about a lot in this podcast.
I mean, yeah, they might flip the switch a couple different times.
How many toggle switches are involved in this process?
But I mean...
7! Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That's a term paper, too. Tracing the history of the self-destruct doomsday button. Because, I mean, these movies... We view them today as pure horror, but they were really science fiction back in their day, too. Like I said, the attitude at the time, I think, was that electricity can do anything. I mean, this was before even television.
Yeah.
I mean, as children in the 90s, we can't even imagine a life without computers. It's wonderful that these films endure to this day to give people that lesson. But, I mean, I really do wonder, do you think the movie would have been better if Henry and Elizabeth didn't make it out of that exploding castle at the end?
Yes.
You think it would have been better?
I think so.
It would have killed the chances for any more sequels.
It would have, but on the other hand, I think it would add more to the tragedy aspect of the film.
Yeah, and really kind of, does Henry deserve to live at the end? I mean, he's sort of implicit in all of this. I mean, really, Dr. Pretorius is really this satanic figure, tempting him into again, to get with the subtext, tempting him into this gay relationship. He sort of is responsible for all the doom and destruction in this movie as anybody else is. And a subplot that was cut out of the film, as I said, the film was originally a lot longer. It's only, really the wonderful thing about these movies is that they're very short. Most of them are only really kind of a little over an hour. You can watch a couple in an evening. Originally the movie was a lot longer, and a subplot that was cut out is, again, Dwight Frye playing a completely different character from the first movie, obviously, since his character in the first movie didn't make it to the sequel. But I mean, there's a whole subplot about him killing his sister and blaming it on the monster. Kind of the whole time Henry's just sort of sitting in the background saying how we need a fresh heart. He's not as bad as Pretorius, he's not as bad as the monster, but I really don't know if he earned that happy ending. I don't know if he did.
I don't think he did.
Yeah. Bride of Frankenstein, this is a movie that we could talk about for a long time, but in the sake of brevity, let's move on to another Edgar Allan Poe film. Have you seen this one either, JD?
I have seen this one. It was a long time ago. I mean, I'll probably have to refresh my memory, but I have seen it.
Yeah, The Raven from 1935, same year as Bride of Frankenstein, is an interesting film. It's a very different movie from Black Cat. It's a much more conventional film. In this movie...
Not remotely close to The Raven.
Oh, it's nothing to... I mean, well, actually, I feel like it's almost a little bit closer to the source material than Black Cat, because in this movie they reference Poe. Lugosi's character is obsessed with the raven, the poem, and the bird. He sees it as his totem or something. There's some talk about that. This is Lugosi playing another villainous role. And he's pretty much crazy. I don't even really remember what his motivation. There's something about...
All I remember about that movie is there was like a magic fight and it...
Oh, no, you're thinking of the Raven with Vincent Price from the 60s.
Oh, my bad. Well, that's the one I've seen.
Okay, yeah, that's a different movie. Again, it has about as much to do with the original poem as that one does. This one, Lugosi plays kind of a social high climber who is a little crazy to begin with, and as the movie goes on, his mania progresses, as they frequently do. Karloff plays a on-the-run criminal, has a very distinctive face, has some sort of facial scarring, and he goes to Lugosi, and Lugosi reconstructs his face, but of course, in the process, he becomes his slave. Something about Lugosi's character in this movie is he has a basement full of death traps. And
Why would you have a basement full of death traps?
Well, you do if you're an evil, mad scientist.
But I mean, you go down there one time to get, because back in that day they did their own canning and stuff. You go down there to get yourself a jar of peaches, And you end up getting your face blown off.
Yeah, walking past the... Watch out for the pendulum when you get the peaches.
Whatever you do, don't step on the red tile.
And there's a wonderful scene where Karloff first wakes up from his surgery and realizes that Lugosi has done something to his face. And he's in a room of mirrors, and he slowly shoots each of the mirrors, and Lugosi's in the room above him looking down through a hole in the floor, cackling the whole time. I remember that sequence. That's a wonderful sequence. In the movie, it's definitely much more conventional than The Black Cat. Pretty much, if The Black Cat is a very morally ambiguous movie, The Raven is a pretty clear-cut story of good versus evil, and I really need to revisit it. And I just remember the sequence where Lugosi has a house full of guesses, and he presses a button that causes an entire bedroom to descend like an elevator into the basement. There's both a pendulum in this film, and then there's a shrinking room in it too, so it takes from that story as well. It's actually how Lugosi's character meets his fate in this movie. He gets stuck in the slowly shrinking room, which is another cliche you see
all the time.
All the time, yeah.
Like in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, for instance.
Any number of Indiana Jones ripoffs. Somebody pulls a lever in a secret room and spikes come out of the walls, and they slowly, Star Wars even. It's a fun film. It makes a good double feature with The Black Cat. It's interesting to compare the two films. Now, have you seen the next movie on our list?
Werewolf in London?
Werewolf of London, from 1935.
I don't think I have.
This is an interesting film. This was the very first attempt by Universal to make a werewolf movie. And it was not successful at the time. It was not well received at all. And it's a very different story than Lon Chaney Jr. and the Wolfman. This is really kind of a straight-up Jekyll and Hyde variation. Henry Hull, I believe, is the actor. Plays a scientist who's in the Orient, looking for a special flower that only blooms in the moonlight. And while finding this flower, he gets attacked by a werewolf. But see, the big difference is the werewolf makeup in this movie is very minimalist. It's basically some sideburns, some fangs, and some funny eyebrows.
Yeah, I think I have seen this movie now that you're describing that.
And it really, when he's the werewolf, he can talk. He's intelligent. He still goes out and kills people. And it's almost kind of a Jack the Ripper story because he has like a cloak and a hat when he goes out and attacks people.
I have seen this movie.
Yeah. It's really kind of a straight up Jekyll and Hyde variation. And it's an interesting film. Really, it's most interesting compare it with The Wolfman. The Wolfman is really responsible for the modern concepts of what a werewolf is. The whole association with the full moon and the association with silver, all this mythology that's so ingrained with the werewolf legend. Carl Sotomac, the screenwriter, made all that shit up. None of it has any basis in actual mythology. So it's interesting to imagine an alternate universe where Werewolf of London was a huge hit, and this movie ended up creating the werewolf legend as we know today. Because in this movie, the werewolf's killed by a regular bullet. And like I said, he's intelligent, he can talk. He pretty much keeps his intellect when he's the wolf. He just has an uncontrollable urge to kill. And there's some weird stuff in this movie. I remember there's a giant flesh-eating plant in one scene. It's very odd. It really doesn't have... they're like in a zoo, and they find this weird pitcher plant with a tentacle. They're like feeding it rabbits or something. It's an odd little movie. There's really a love triangle. There's the scientist is married to a wife, and then there's his friend who's in love with the wife, but of course doesn't do anything. So at the end of the movie, when the monster gets killed, the woman doesn't have to be alone. She can just run to the next partner. Sort of a staple.
Which is how it works in real life.
And you see that in Frankenstein as well. There's a love interest even, I don't know about Dracula, but you see that cliche a lot in these movies.
Dracula has his bride, so technically there's a love square.
We didn't talk about the brides of Dracula very much.
No, we didn't.
Do we have anything to say about those, JD?
Big boobs.
They're hot, yeah. They're pretty attractive. Getting back on track. Werewolf of London, interesting movie. I feel like it's probably most of work to horror historians, but you should check it out if you haven't seen it. You should check out all these movies, with maybe the exception of one that we'll get to in a bit. Next on our list is another sequel to an iconic movie of the 30s. Have you seen this one, JD?
Well, I'm not sure. Is this the one where she's in the prep school, or is that Son of Dracula?
There's no prep school in either of those movies.
Well, she goes to an all-girls school. The teacher has the medallion, and she puts her under a spell and turns her into a vampire, and then at the end, yes, this movie exists. I've seen it. I'm pretty sure it's Son of Dracula.
Well, we're not talking about Son.
I know, you're talking about Daughter of Dracula. I don't know that I've seen this one.
Dracula's Daughter is an interesting film. You want to talk about a queer subtext. This is the beginning of the lesbian vampire.
You're right, it is.
This is the very first lesbian vampire. If Dracula was pretty much unambiguously pure evil, Dracula's daughter is really as much as a tragic figure as Frankenstein. She doesn't want to be a vampire. At the beginning of the movie, she cremates the body of her father, and she feels like her curse is lifted. She wants to be a normal person. And really, she has a manservant, whose name escapes me at the moment, who is really kind of the evil presence who is in a lot of way tempting her. And I feel like it's almost an allegory for drug addiction. These days, vampires and drug addiction is a connection you see a lot. She feels inexplicably, uncontrollably drawn to attack people. Even in 1936, it even kind of used the concept of the lesbian vampire for titillation. I remember I've seen advertisement at the time, something about, she's on the streets and she's preying on the daughters of England. Even at the time, they sort of used that concept to sell the movie. It's a very subtle film. It's a very slow movie, which means I didn't like it when I first saw it as a young child. I couldn't get into it at all. But rewatching it now, it's definitely worth seeing. And there's a scene where she invites a girl back to her home to take nude photographs of her, and the girl's stripping down to her underwear, and you don't see her do that, obviously. But it was probably pretty hot stuff in 36. It's still kind of hot stuff even today. It's an interesting film. Definitely worth seeing a lot.
I do agree with you on the slowness factor, because
it's
back when I first tried to watch it, it was so horribly slow. I made it 10 minutes, and I'm done with it.
It's a slow movie. That is a legitimate criticism towards this film. But I don't know, it's rewarding. It's worth seeing. Another interesting thing is, at the beginning of the movie, Van Helsing is arrested for killing Dracula. The police come up to him and say, what did you do? And he said, I just killed Dracula. And they put him in jail. It's kind of a funny, sort of realistic take on the film. It's in much ways a much more realistic film than Dracula, which is really kind of all about mythology and legends and black magic. While Dracula's Daughter is a little more humanistic and a little more logical in some ways. Worth seeing more than once. 39 brings us The Son of Frankenstein.
I don't think that I've seen this one.
You haven't seen this? Is a good one. This is the last really good Frankenstein movie in the series. First off, it's the last movie with Karloff. It has a really great cast. Basil Rathbone, who was very famous at the time for playing Sherlock Holmes. Lionel Atwill, a Universal house player that you see in so many things. And of course, Bela Lugosi is in this too, and he plays Igor. Igor with a Y. Y-G-O-R. It's an interesting movie. It's a longer movie. It's 90 minutes long. It's the longest of the classic Universal horror movies. 30 years after the events of Bride of Frankenstein, it's about the adult son of Frankenstein, Wolf Frankenstein, who is moving back to his home country with his wife and his 3-year-old son. This 3-year-old son is the beginning of the cliche of the annoying kid in the horror movie. The annoying kid that exists for no other reason than to be put in peril. It all started here, folks. I'm telling you, these movies were the birth of every trope and cliche of American horror. Anyway, the Frankenstein movies are kind of like proto-slasher films in a lot of ways. Almost. I mean, you could probably trace the DNA back. And the reason Boris Karloff left the role at the end of this film is he thought the monster had become too much of a monster. He kills a lot of people in this one, too. And a scene I remember is he clobbers a guy over the head and then puts him underneath a carriage and lets the carriage ride over him. And you actually see that happen in the film. Even though it's pretty obviously a dummy, it's still kind of wow, that's pretty gruesome stuff for 30
back for that time,
The first movies predate the enforcement of the Hays Code, when censorship became a big deal in Hollywood. But this movie from 39 doesn't. I'm pretty sure that the Hays Code was being enforced by 39. Very famously, the Frankenstein monster wears a fuzzy vest for some reason. Like I said, it's 30 years later, and it's implied in the film. They never... Something we haven't talked about. Not yet. It hasn't become a factor yet, but the continuity in these movies are pretty loose. Especially as the series goes on. It doesn't really explain how the monster survived the explosion at the end of Bride of Frankenstein. Igor implies that the monster has been roaming around the village, kind of terrorizing it the whole time, when he got struck by lightning and went into a coma. And of course, Wolf Frankenstein, who at first has no interest in his father's ghastly legacy, as in all Frankenstein movies about children, are drawn into the family legacy and feels uncontrollably compelled to bring the monster back to life. Which of course he does. Pretty quickly realizes that wasn't a good idea.
It's never a good idea.
Yeah, and then the character of Igor is really the villain in this movie. The monster is almost a force of nature that is being directed by Igor. Actually, they hang him, and he survives. And the whole movie, Lugosi's neck is kind of at this angle, and it sort of affects his whole performance. It's a good performance from Lugosi. As soon as the monster is revived, he uses it as a sort of a minion to go out and take revenge on the people of the town, and that pretty much drives the whole plot of the film. Lionel Atwill's character is sort of the sheriff of the town who has a wooden arm, an element parodied brilliantly in Young Frankenstein. At the end of the movie, something that really shocked me when I first saw the movie, when he's fighting the monster tears his wooden arm off, and I know it's a wooden arm, but the fact that the dude is essentially being dismembered there on screen, pretty heavy stuff for 39. Great performance from Basil Rathbone. This movie really has a fantastic cast. Where at the end of the movie where he swings on a rope and kicks the monster into the sulfur pit that's introduced solely for the purpose of taking the monster out at the end.
Plot device.
Yeah, I like it a lot. It's definitely a step down from the first two films. I feel like in a lot of ways it's a worthy addition to the series, as opposed to some of the later sequels, which we will get into soon. But now we have to discuss another very important figure in the Universal Monster cycle.
Wolfman.
Yes, the Wolfman.
Finally.
Yeah. If you look at these dates, there was something, all of these movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, and to a lesser degree, Edgar Allan Poe films, all kind of came out in the early part of the 30s. 31, 34, 32. And after that, there was kind of a lull. There was a long waiting period between Frankenstein and Bride and Dracula's Daughter. I get the impression that the monster movies didn't really immediately take off. In 41, in the World War II era, is really when the films really sort of become a big deal again. And The Wolfman really kind of started this revival.
Everyone really liked this movie.
Oh, it's a great film.
I mean, you want to talk about atmosphere.
Yes, there's a lot of that fog is back.
There is such thick atmosphere, I can't believe that Lon Chaney Jr. was able to breathe. That's how much atmosphere is in this movie.
Yeah, and Lon Chaney Jr. was, of course, the son of Lon Chaney Sr., who was really the prototypal horror star in so many ways. His dad, he didn't want his son to become the same sort of actor that he was. And inevitably it happened. Lon Chaney Jr. is really an interesting presence in horror, especially in the Wolfman movies. First off, in this first movie, he's so American. The movie takes place in Wales, and his character is Welsh. It's implied that he grew up in America. He has almost, I don't really know what kind of accent that is, but it's very distinctive.
Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah, it's sort of an American, sort of Midwestern kind of accent. And when he first shows up in town, his dad is a baron or a count or a lord. He's some sort of minor royalty. And everybody else in the movie is very prim and proper. And Lon Chaney is, I don't want to say vulgar, but he's American. He's American. You almost feel like this is a movie about a culture clash. And especially how he meets the love interest in the movie, Gwen, by spying on her as she's through the window with the telescope. And then proceeds to go up to her in the shop and say this to her. I don't think that would work, picking up a woman with that tactic today. I don't think that would work.
No, that would usually get you slapped and then slapped with a restraining order.
Yes, I suspect. But it worked. It worked for Lon Chaney Jr. because he's charming. Got a great cast. Claude Rains. Bela Lugosi is in this movie playing a character named Bella. Maria Openskaya, I believe is how you pronounce her name, as the Gypsy. Another great role. And this is a movie, even though all of the mythology, as I said, was pretty much invented whole cloth, there's so much thick mythology in this movie, and you really feel like this is this cycle of guy going into the woods, killing a wolf, getting bitten, becoming a werewolf. I just feel like this is a cycle that has been going on for a long time. And it's an interesting movie, too, what time period is this supposed to take place in? Presumably it takes place in 41, but you have, modern cars and modern dress, but then you have, gypsies and town festivals.
I mean, technically speaking, there are still gypsies around today.
Yeah, but they don't travel around in horse-pulled buggies.
Well, maybe not, but I mean, this also takes place, where does it take, is this one Transylvania as well? No,
it's in Wales. It's in a real town in Wales, that name I can't remember.
Well, nonetheless, I mean, they're still in Europe. So.
Yeah, they're in Europe. But the point I'm making is I feel like it has to be intentional, that this is a film of two worlds. It's almost about the sort of Eastern American logical man being involved in the European old magical superstition. The poem, even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers at night can become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the winter moon is bright. Or autumn moon is bright. All this wonderful stuff. And of course the makeup. We have to talk about that.
Yeah.
Does it look like a wolf to you?
It looks to me like it's a wolf man. I mean, I know that's kind of
the
playing
title of the movie.
To the movie, but that's what it is. It doesn't strike me as a werewolf.
No.
It strikes me more...
It looks like a fusion of man and wolf.
Yeah. He's basically a big burly redneck.
We have some of those here in our town in West Virginia.
I mean, wasn't he wearing plaid?
He wasn't wearing plaid, but he's wearing, even as a werewolf, he has work pants and a button-down shirt on.
Yeah,
so the costume he wears in all of these movies.
The facial features,
I love that he has a little dog nose on top of his real nose. I love that.
Yeah, he gets a little bit of a dog nose and he gets some snarly bulldog teeth.
It's a wonderful makeup design, of course, completely iconic. And
it's a great design.
And I love the fact that he walks on his feet are raised like a dog. You see that in one shot in the movie.
Yeah,
it's cool. The scenes of him stalking the girl in the foggy woods, very dark shadows, I love that stuff. I live for that kind of thing.
In the fall, it looked like gloom.
It really does.
Gloom incarnate.
And this is an interesting film. It starts out kind of lighthearted. Larry Talbot is a lighthearted character. And then as the movie progresses, it gets a lot darker. There are a lot of interesting themes about family and about culture clashes and about when you're doing a werewolf movie, you almost have to talk about sort of the werewolf as a metaphor for the beast inside of all of us.
Yeah.
I know there was a scene cut from the movie where Larry Talbot's transformation was a lot more gradual. There's a scene where he goes to the carnival with the girl, and he was apparently supposed to fight a bear. They put like a bear in boxing gloves and have you fight a bear as part of the carnival, which seems grossly irresponsible.
I, for one, don't know how that would work.
Yeah, but apparently Lon Chaney was supposed to beat a bear up, and this was supposed to be an example of the werewolf having more of an effect on his personality. And there's a wonderful sequence where it's almost Hitchcocky in the way, this montage of like the canes moving and eyes, and it's sort of a weird little freak-out moment, but it's effective. It's a very psychological movie in a lot of ways. More psychological than some of the earlier Universal movies.
It's more psychological horror than straight up...
Well, I mean, it's a monster movie.
So it plays more to the mental aspect than it does to the physical, make you jump or make you...
I mean, none of these movies are about jump scares.
Well,
the jump scare wasn't invented until later.
No, I didn't mean like that. I just meant like, they don't horrify you. It doesn't horrify you as much as like maybe Frankenstein or Dracula would. It's more on the psychological...
I mean, I agree with you. It's a character study, straight up.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the Wolfman himself is a lot scarier than Frankenstein or Dracula.
I don't think so.
I mean, Dracula can be reasoned with. Frankenstein is kind of a child, but the Wolfman really just kind of wants to kill you hard. He doesn't really have any motivating factors beyond tear your throat out and rip you up. He's kind of a complete ruthless animal in a lot of ways. We both agree Wolfman's a great movie. Ghost of Frankenstein is the next one.
And I don't think I've seen this one either.
Following the Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr. became Universal's big horror star, and the plan was to put him in all of their monster movies from now on. This is a pretty well-known bit of trivia, but Lon Chaney Jr. is the only guy to play all of the big Universal monsters. He's played Frankenstein, he's played Dracula, he played the Wolfman, he played the Mummy. He also played Man-Made Monster, which is a movie I'd like to talk about at some point. Ghost of Frankenstein really is a big turning point in the series. First off, they stopped being A pictures at this point and started becoming B pictures. And really, at this point, the monster is a less nuanced character. He's pretty much unambiguously a monster. That sounds retarded, but the monster is a monster in this movie. Igor is in this one too. In fact, Bela Lugosi's Igor plays a pretty big part in this film, from what I remember. And this is really where the continuity begins to fall apart. Igor dies in Son of Frankenstein. Wolf Frankenstein shoots him to death. In this movie, Igor is alive at the beginning of it. Somehow, Igor was just playing dead for some reason.
And he got struck by a lightning bolt.
Obviously, that's what happened. The movie begins with the villagers destroying the castle. They finally say, yeah, we've had it up to here with this Frankenstein business. We're going to go blow up that damn castle. This is like the third or fourth time the Castle Frankenstein has been destroyed, and it will be destroyed many more times before the franchise is over.
They've destroyed it in every movie, haven't they?
Well, they didn't destroy it in the first one.
No, that was the windmill.
The windmill burns down. So, and basically in the process of destroying the castle, they free the monster from the sulfur pit where he's been encased all these years. And he kind of stumbles out, and he's a little sluggish, but mostly he's fine. Really getting dropped into a boiling pit of hot sulfur didn't affect the monster too much. And he lost the vest at this point. He's back to wearing a suit somehow. Apparently he changed outfits while in the sulfur pit. Igor and the monster go on the road. They go on a trip, and at one point during the trip, the monster is struck by lightning, and this really puts him back at full strength. And they get to this new town. I think the town is Viseria, which is the setting for pretty much all of the other monster movies from this point on. And they meet Ludwig Frankenstein, the other son of Henry Frankenstein that just wasn't mentioned in the last movie. Cedric Hardwicke plays Ludwig Frankenstein in this. I'm not a big fan of Lon Chaney's portrayal of the monster. He's really rather mechanical. Chaney, who is an actor capable of great nuance, doesn't really bring a lot of nuance to his role here. When he was under a lot of makeup, you see this in his Mummy movies as well. Lon Chaney, surprisingly, really couldn't act through makeup. He was good as a face actor, but when the makeup went on, he just kind of scowled and killed people.
Well, when you're used to the traditional, Boris Karloff.
Yeah, it really is a difference from Karloff to... I mean, each actor really brings their own thing to the creature. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, which we'll discuss soon enough. Ghost of Frankenstein, and the plot basically is that Igor wants to put his brain in the monster's body. And the reason that the movie's called Ghost of Frankenstein, because something we haven't talked about, is the confusion of, is the monster Frankenstein, is the Dr. Frankenstein? Some people say, well, the monster is the doctor's son, so there's no reason why he can't be called Frankenstein, since he would carry on the family name. Is that bullshit to you too?
Yeah, that's bullshit.
He's the monster, or the creation, whatever. He's not Frankenstein. He's the Frankenstein monster, but he's not just Frankenstein. They justify the title because there's a scene where Ludwig Frankenstein has a vision of the ghost of his father, not played by Colin Clive, who was already dead at this point. And that's really where the title comes from. And the movie ends with, they successfully put Igor's brain in the monster's body, but he's blind for some reason. And it's really sort of weird to see the monster talking with Bela Lugosi's voice. And he's stumbling around the laboratory, and of course he sets it on fire. Bing, boom, everybody's dead. I think there's a love interest, an assistant, and a young daughter that make it out alive, but the doctor and the monster and Igor, all dead. Until the next movie, anyway.
They always come back.
I need to revisit Ghost of Frankenstein. I remember not being all that impressed with it. Anyway, obviously this movie was a success because next year we get another film that's a very important turning point in this series. And that's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Now, you've seen this, right? I know you've seen this one.
Pretty sure I have.
Yeah. And this movie is important because it's the first time they decided to randomly stick the two monsters together, let them go at it. And that really kind of basically points to the direction of the rest of the franchise from this point on. I like Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. A little slow. It's kind of dumb, but when it gets down to it, you can't beat the entertainment factor of the Wolfman fighting Frankenstein. The movie is worth sitting through just for that last 10 minutes when they do actually fight each other. You can trace the DNA of Freddy vs. Jason back to this movie. This was the first monster mash.
Isn't this the movie where Lon Chaney Jr. plays Frankenstein's monster, but not the Wolfman?
You got that backwards.
Oh, I got that backwards.
He wanted to play both parts, and they wanted to do it through trickery that he could be both the monster and the Wolfman, but they ended up thinking that was impossible. The movie begins with grave robbers breaking into Larry Talbot's tomb, and when the light of the full moon hits his body, he's revived. And all shit starts going down again. And Marianne Up in Sky is back in this, which is cool. And she basically, Lon Chaney seeks her out, and they basically decide they're going to go to Dr. Frankenstein so Lon Chaney can die. From this point on, Larry Talbot's goal in these movies becomes suicide. And he's very bad at it.
Why didn't he shoot himself in the face with a silver bullet?
Well, it wouldn't work because as soon as the moon hits his body, he'll come back to life. Seems like bad planning. Yeah, it really just seems like he could probably just kill himself as a human. That would be the end of it, but that becomes his goal over the course of the next 4 films. And of course, anyway, they decide that Dr. Frankenstein is the person they got to go to. And of course, Frankenstein's daughter, played by a different actress than in the last movie, is in this. And they go to Viseria, and there's another scientist that comes involved somehow. My memory's a little foggy. I really should have rewatched all these movies before doing this. Podcast 101, kids. And he, of course, and as soon as a doctor walks into a castle and sees the monster, he immediately becomes irrevocably drawn to reviving it. That seems to be a almost supernatural ability the monster has over people. There's a weird continuity error here, and I love weird continuity errors. The last movie, the monster burned to death in a fire. This movie, the monster is found frozen in a block of ice. No clue how he got there. And something we haven't talked about, Bela Lugosi plays the Frankenstein monster in this movie.
That's what I was...
Yeah, he plays the monster. Of course, this is the part he turned down a decade earlier. From all reports that I've read, Bela Lugosi was very bad with money. So he was often hard up for work. And the reason they did this is because Igor's brain went in the monster's body at the end of the last movie. It seemed like a natural progression. And the monster was supposed to talk in this film with Lugosi's voice. How weird would have that been? I personally am not impressed with Lugosi's portrayal of the Frankenstein monster. What was originally the plan is the monster was blind. And that's why he's reaching out with his hands up and sort of the stiff, robotic gait that has since become the cliche. In post-production, they realized how ridiculous it was, the monster walking around talking with Bela Lugosi's voice. They dubbed it all out. There's no dialogue from that character at all. Though I believe if you watch carefully, you can see his lips moving at some point and nothing coming out.
Yeah, the time I saw it, maybe I saw his lips moving.
Yeah, maybe the performance would have been better if you could hear him talk, but not impressed with Lugosi's take on Frankenstein. Making me retroactively glad that he didn't get the part in the original. And really, the movie is more of a Wolfman sequel than a Frankenstein sequel. The monster doesn't really do a lot. He basically, and this is really kind of the sad trend for these later films, he spends most of the movie sitting on a slab, not really doing anything for the majority of the film. Until he gets
back to the last 5 minutes
exactly.
To kill whatever the bad monster is.
You got it, yeah. That last fight, the last 10 minutes movie where the Wolfman and Frankenstein finally freaking fight is cool. And as a monster kid, that shit's cool. And there's some good Wolfman stuff in this movie. There's a cool scene of him jumping onto a box of barrels. That's you can see a lot of wolf-like movements. He kind of is lunging and leaping like an animal. And during the fight scene at the end, you see that too. Frankenstein meets Wolfman, cheesy but cool. I dig it. Next movie, Son of Dracula.
Which actually doesn't have a boy in it at all.
No. Lon Chaney plays Dracula, or he plays Alucard in this. This is the beginning of the Alucard concept. And pretty much from here on in, if a son of Dracula appears, he's going to be named Alucard. And nobody's going to think to spell that backwards until midway through the film. But Son of Dracula is interesting. First off, Lon Chaney, terrible Dracula. He's got a weird little handlebar mustache. He looks like Lon Chaney. He doesn't really fool with any accent. He pretty much sounds like Lon Chaney. And as we were saying earlier, Lon Chaney is kind of cool in a melancholy, sad role, but he doesn't really have the seductive, tempting evil that Dracula should have. That's the movie's biggest weakness. But overall, this is a neat film, because it takes place in the Louisiana Bayou. And this movie is really shot like a film noir, to the point where there's even one of the main motivating stories of the film is a woman that is trying to seduce a guy and then meets Dracula and willingly becomes a vampire so she can kill Dracula and then become the more powerful vampire. This really is almost a film noir in a lot of ways. In fact, the film leaves it kind of ambiguous whether Alucard is really the son of Dracula, as the title implies, or if he's really Dracula, as in the same Dracula that Bela Lugosi was. We don't really know. The movie doesn't really make it clear. I've always assumed that it was the same Dracula, but who the heck knows? If the continuity in the Frankenstein movies is weak, the continuity in the Dracula movies is almost non-existent. But there are some cool scenes in this movie. This is the first time where somebody tries to shoot Dracula and he just puts his cape up and the bullets pass right through him. You know, it's not a bad flick. I dig Son of Dracula. It has definitely got some strong atmosphere. And a cool ending where the hero decides to track down Dracula and burn his coffin. And his coffin is kept in the swamp. Rises out of the swamp water every time Dracula appears, which is sort of cool. And this is the first movie where the sunlight hits Dracula and he immediately turns into a skeleton. Which is kind of cheesy, but part of the universal appeal for me.
Well, at least it's sparkle.
No, there's no sparkling in these movies. But have you seen Son of Dracula?
I don't think that I have.
I think you're confusing it with a different movie. Son of Dracula, like I said, the biggest weak point is Lon Chaney is not very good as Dracula. But overall, there's a lot of cool stuff going on in this film. Now, the next movie is the first really huge monster mash, and that's House of Frankenstein. And at this point, the title is meaningless. Yeah, this really is kind of an all-star movie. It's got Boris Karloff is back, playing a mad scientist who was attempting to put a human's brain in a dog's body or something. He's an evil brain surgeon. And him and his hunchback assistant, Daniel, are in a prison when, once again, lightning, the Universal Studios' favorite Deus Ex Machina, lightning, basically causes them to break out, and they go free, and they go on the run. And they end up taking over a traveling roadshow that just happens to feature Dracula's skeleton with a stake through his heart. And of course, when you pull the stake out, he comes back to life. And I think this is the first time that cliche appeared.
No, I mean, I know that it appears in later movies like Subspecies,
Dracula 2000, etc.
Yeah.
Dracula's played movie by John Carradine. As, again, like I said, if the continuity is bad in the other movies, it's non-existent in the Dracula films. I feel like John Carradine's Dracula is not the same character as Bela Lugosi's Dracula. You know, later on in the movie...
I hate John Carradine.
Really?
I really do. I despise it so much.
Really? I like John Carradine's Dracula. He's cool. He's tall, he's skinny, he's got a mustache, and wears a top hat.
Yeah, but he reminds me so much of Mumbo Jumbo.
Mumbo Jumbo?
You know, off of Teen Titans with the magician guy.
I don't remember that, but that's a segue.
Well, point being, he reminds me of that guy.
Okay, I like John Carradine's Dracula. Something we didn't talk about. Son of Dracula is the first time you saw Dracula become a bat on screen. And it was done with animation. Pretty crude. Still kind of cool. The thing about these monster bashes is that really they're almost anthology films. The first half of this movie is about Dracula. And he goes to this house where the scientist is living and tries to seduce a girl and then gets killed. And that's like Act 1, Dracula's done. Then the Wolfman comes in. Boris Karloff's evil scientist character explores the ruins of the castle where the monster and Wolfman fought in the end of the last movie and finds them frozen in blocks of ice. Melts them out. And in this movie, Frankenstein's monster is played by Glenn Strange, who would go on to be better known on the show Gunsmoke, playing the bartender. If Lugosi and Chaney's Frankenstein's monster lacked the nuance of Karloff, Strange has no nuance at all. He is just a straight-up lumbering, dumb juggernaut. Not a lot of character development going on there at all. As I said, the monster is pretty much just on a slab until the last 5 minutes of the movie.
And then comes in and bitch slaps all the monsters and calls it a day.
Yeah, kind of. And there's a subplot in here that's kind of interesting, where Lon Chaney's Larry Talbot has earned the affection of a gypsy girl, but also the deformed hunchback assistant is also in love with the gypsy girl. So there's kind of a love triangle there. Doesn't work out well for anybody. Nobody makes it out of this movie alive. Thinking back on it, there's probably some wholesome, good people, love interest in this film. I don't remember them. They're not important to the plot. Much to her dismay, the gypsy girl has to kill the Wolfman, and then when the Frankenstein monster comes alive, he kills the hunchback, and then he picks up Boris Karloff's character as the pitchfork and torch-wielding townspeople descend on the castle, and they walk off into a very conveniently located quicksand pit. End of movie. House of Frankenstein, at this point, the writing was getting a little lazy. And really, there's only so many ways you can wedge Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, Mad Scientist, Hunchback all into the same movie. It's getting a little crowded at that point. It's fun. It's not a good film, but I dig it. As a monster guy, I like it.
You gotta like your monster mashups.
It's just that appeal of seeing all the monsters in one movie, even if it doesn't make any sense. If House of Frankenstein is fun, the next movie, House of Dracula, which is, for all intents and purposes, pretty much the end of the series, is weaker. Dracula shows up again, alive, at the beginning of this movie. No explanation. Larry Talbot shows up, alive, again. No explanation. Really, the only hint of continuity to the last film is when our scientist character finds the monster and the skeleton of Boris Karloff's character and conveniently located pit near his castle. So many damn castles in Eastern Europe. No wonder they breed so many mad scientists. When you see a castle, an evil vampire count or a mad scientist has to move in. That's part of the leasing deal, I think.
You buy this castle, you must go mad.
Exactly, yeah. The one really interesting about this movie is it's all about the monsters wanting to be cured. Dracula comes to this psychologist because he wants to be cured. Larry Talbot comes to this psychologist because he wants to be cured. Dracula's vampirism is explained as a blood disease. Larry Talbot's lycanthropy is explained as a pressure on his brain. And it's sort of an interesting approach. Scientifically explaining the monster transformations is something that really became popular later. It seemed like you saw a lot of those movies in the 90s. It sort of starts here. Not only is this movie got Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein in it, but you've also got this scientist who starts out as good, is turned evil when Dracula pumps some of his blood into his body, and this somehow causes him to become a very Jekyll and Hyde-like character. And there's also a hunchback in this movie, but instead of being a sad, pathetic, gross guy, it's actually a kind of cute woman, which is a little weird. I really feel at this point they were kind of running out of ideas, like, we gotta get a hunchback in here somehow. Make it a girl, that's different.
Well,
At this point, these movies have been going on for almost 20 years. House of Dracula is kind of a tired affair. And you want to talk about too much stuff going on in this movie. It really just feels like 6 different movies kind of cut together. And the Frankenstein monster does nothing. He literally shows up at the end just to put in a token appearance, immediately gets killed in a fire. He does nothing. He doesn't even kill the bad guy. Because after Larry Talbot is cured, he shoots the mad scientist. And Larry Talbot walks away from this movie cured. He gets a happy ending. I think he even gets a girlfriend.
That dick.
Like, he spent the last 3 movies trying to kill himself.
What the hell was he thinking?
Wolfman just needed a shrink. So House of Dracula is pretty tired, kind of a sad end to the series proper, because after this point, these movies became comedies. The next movie is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Are we going to talk about these movies, or are these going to be saved for another time?
I think we should just save these for another time.
Kind of an inauspicious end to the franchise that started so greatly. Before the Universal monsters go away forever, there was really one more entry in the series, in 1954. This is almost 5 years later from the last movie, and horror has changed. We're in the post-nuclear era now. The line between sci-fi and horror is much thinner than it was even before. If the plot device in the 30s and 40s was electricity, in the 50s the plot device is nuclear power. Nuclear power can do anything.
Or aliens.
Yeah, or aliens. Lots of aliens, In fact, Creature from the Black Lagoon was directed by Jack Arnold, who previously did It Came from Outer Space. Creature from the Black Lagoon, it's a science fiction film. I really love this movie.
I know.
Always talking about the goddamn gill-man. Can't get through one evening without hearing about it.
We might as well just talk about all 3 movies.
These movies really sort of go together. It's almost like a 3-act play in 3 different movies.
The first one's the only one I'm really familiar with. I haven't really seen the other 2 all the way through.
Okay, well, we'll talk about them.
I like them. I don't know. I know the later 2 were a little bit more campy.
They're not as good as the first one.
But
Part 2 especially.
The first one, it's a great, it's kind of like a Beauty and the Beast story.
Oh, it absolutely is a Beauty and the Beast story. Interesting thing...
that was before Beastly, bitches.
Oh, God, don't even get me started. The movie is, you know what it is. It's King Kong. The Creature from the Black Lagoon and The Creature's Revenge, or Revenge of the Creature, is basically King Kong in 2 movies. These people go to a strange new land, under the auspice of a scientific expedition, and find a monster. And he immediately falls in love with the woman in the group, the beautiful Julie Adams. And,
Yes, Zach, we know. You have a crush on her.
Shut up. And then in the next movie, he's brought to the New World. Creature from the Black Lagoon, there's an environmental theme in this movie. Maybe unintentionally. But there's a great sequence where Julie Adams is sitting on the boat smoking, as everybody did in 1953, or 54. And she throws her cigarette butt into the lake and doesn't even think about it. It cuts down into the water, and the creature is sitting there at the bottom of the lake looking up, and then that theme that plays every time. There's even a suggestion of the monster that... Very very famous music sting. But he's looking up at the cigarette butt as if saying, what the hell are you doing? You know, you're coming into my home and you're knocking my shit over. And it makes his response to all the people. And the creature is pretty brutal. He has a very high body count in this movie. You know, he kills a lot of people. And it's not really off-screen. You don't see him, like, crushing skulls and slashing faces. It's more than implied. The scene where, I don't remember the character's name, but he's the asshole in the group. He's going after the creature in a scuba gear, a harpoon gun, and the creature pulls his oxygen tube and the guy drowns. The creature is such a great design. We've come the full way from Jack Pierce making the monster designs out of a kit, every day, new, fresh, to a full-on rubber suit. As opposed to a lot of the other rubber suit monsters that would come later on in the 50s. The creature is really, it looks like a living thing.
Yeah.
Its design makes sense. It seems plausible.
It doesn't seem cheap like the other rubber.
Yeah, it doesn't seem cheesy. It actually works. He seems like a real... his design, it makes sense. The scenes of him swimming underwater, something you might not notice is Rico Browning plays the creature. He held his breath the entire time, so you don't see any bubbles coming out. Something they didn't do in the sequels. And there's these very long scenes of Julie Adams swimming in her white swimsuit. Pretty leering. It's almost exploitive. But it sort of makes sense because the creature is kind of looking at her, and there's that great scene where she's swimming and he sort of like is reaching out and trying to touch her feet. The creature, more so than maybe even Frankenstein, is looking for love.
All the wrong places.
Yeah, he's looking for love in all the wrong places because people are terrified of him. I've always related to the creature the most out of any of the monsters, even more so than Frankenstein, because he is just kind of a love-struck sort of big dumb puppy. More and more, every time I watch this movie, I legitimately want to see those kids run off together and make it work and get married and have a bunch of little half-human, half-fish hybrids.
That would be horrible.
Which is weird because Julie Adams, her character Kay, is terrified of the monster. And really, she has plausible reason to, since he's gone through
and... his eyes.
Yeah, he's gone through and slaughtered pretty much everybody else in the movie at this point. Yeah, and of course this film was originally shot in 3D. This was a big 3D hit for Universal.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of scenes of like them firing the harpoon guns. And there's that great scene where the guy is sitting in the boat with a broken leg and the creature's hand is reaching through the porthole at him. There's a lot of 3D gags in here. I could talk about Creature from the Black Lagoon for hours. I adore this movie. It's wonderfully shot. When you see it as a kid, it seems like a simple monster movie with really not a lot to offer. But watching it as an adult, there's a lot of stuff going on in this movie. Wonderful cast. I love the creature design. I just love this movie. Now let's talk about the sequels, which are not as good.
They're incredibly campy.
The first one, The Creature's Revenge, the problem with this movie is, first off, they've changed the creature's design. He's got big old bug eyes. I hate the new mask. It really ruins the subtlety of the original. They capture him, they take him back to the Florida Everglades, they put him on display in kind of a SeaWorld sort of place. But they do asshole things to him, like, it's like, okay, here's some fish, gill-man, go get it. And then they shock him with a giant cattle prod. No wonder the guy gets pissed off and starts killing people,
You shocked me with a cattle prod. I'm level
John Agar, the iron-chinned star of many Universal science fiction movies of this era, who's also in Tarantula and The Mole People, is the star here. And, of course, very famously, Clint Eastwood. This was his first movie.
I was not aware of that.
It might have been, it's either his first or his second. He's in Tarantula, too. He has a bit role as a lab assistant. And this movie was on Mystery Science Theater. And there's a great one-liner when Clint Eastwood walks on and one of the robots says, "He's bad. This was his first and last movie." But Revenge of the Creature is, in the first movie, when the quote-unquote love story between the monster and the woman Kay is very natural and works really well. In this movie, the love story where he becomes obsessed with John Agar's girlfriend, it doesn't work as well. It just seems kind of tacked on. Really sort of blatantly emulative of the first movie. And in the first movie, where it takes a whole bunch of bullet shots from a whole bunch of rifles to put the creature down, in this movie, the cops shoot him once in the back of the head and he dies. Well, he doesn't die because he shows up fine in the next movie. The Gill-man's like Wolverine,
Well, I mean, a blow to the head.
I don't know. It always struck me as a lot weaker. Creature doesn't work as well in a city as he does in the jungle. There is one great shot where he picks up a car and rolls it down a sand dune. That's pretty cool. That's my favorite moment in Revenge of the Creature. And then the last movie, which is a lot of ways the end of the Universal cycle, is The Creature Walks Among Us, which is an interesting film. In this film, the scientists go into the Florida Everglades looking for the creature. They find him, they set him on fire. Assholes.
Pricks.
Yeah, they set him on fire. It causes him to evolve. Basically, all his fish parts fall off and he becomes a more human-like creature. Which is interesting. Sort of causes him to become an even more sympathetic character. I've always felt the creature was sympathetic, even if the movie kind of treated him pretty blatantly as a monster. But in this one, he's really a lot more sympathetic. And one of the interesting things about this film, basically he's turned into a human, they put him in a weird nylon Dr. Evil suit, and they basically keep him in their backyard. And again, he becomes obsessed with a girl. But in this movie, the girl is married to this real asshole. This guy is like really flat out abusive. And it becomes pretty obvious from the early moments of the movie that at the end of the movie, the creature's going to kill him. And even though it's inevitable, the way the movie is drawn out makes it kind of interesting. How bad of a monster is the creature when you've got this abusive asshole smacking his wife around throughout the whole movie? And, there's some interesting stuff. He fights a mountain lion in one scene. And it's pretty much inevitable that he's going to get out. But when he gets out and finally kills the guy, the movie at this point becomes very sad. Earlier in the film, after the creature changes, he gets off the boat and tries to swim the ocean, but he can't breathe underwater anymore. He doesn't have gills. And the movie ends with him walking up to the beach and looking out longingly towards the ocean, and walking towards the ocean. And that's the end of the film. Is he intentionally committing suicide because he knows there's no place for him in this mixed up, crazy world? Or is he just trying to go back home? He wants to go back to the place he considers home and doesn't realize that this is going to doom him in the end.
That's it.
I feel like it brings the melancholy that is implicit in the first movie and makes it much more obvious in this movie. Creature Walks Among Us, it's slow. It's a lot slower than the other two films. And I think that's why its reputation isn't very good. But there's some interesting ideas in this film, and I like it. I feel like it's a good wrap-up to not only the Creature series, but really kind of the Universal canon in general. And I think that's it for the very first episode of the Bangers and Mash Show. What do you think, JD?
I think that about covers it.
Next time, he's going to do more talking. I feel like I really dominated this episode.
He has seen a lot more movies than I have.
Yeah, well, it's because I don't have as much of a social life as you do.
That's true.
For those who don't want to listen to the YouTube broadcast, I'm going to set up a rapid share or a mega upload or something like that so you can download this and listen to it on your iPod if you want to. Anyway, I'm Mr. Bangers, a.k.a. Zach.
And I'm Mr. Mash, a.k.a. JD.
And this has been the Bangers and Mash Show. See you guys again soon.
Adios.
The wine tonight is nobly blessed. Parola, paroline. Parola, paroline. By such a lady and her guest. Parola, paroline. Parola, paroline. To them I toast, come drink with me. That may they ever happy be. And may they live eternally. Parola, come one and all and sing a song. Parola, parole, for life is short, but death is long.